So I apologize for not having any Dutch whatsoever. Tan Bugum Verga give? No? No Irish speakers? English it is. Okay. Okay, so thanks very much for having me here in Creative Mornings Utrecht. I think it's the anniversary talk, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
So I think well done. Whole year, it's great. I think as I understand the format, I'll just take about 15 minutes or so to really ask 3 questions about reuse. And of course, since I'm the one with the microphone, I'll try to come up with a couple of directions or answers. I hope that's okay, and then we can have a chat about anything you'd like to. So I start with a quote that was attributed to Coco Chanel, which is that only those with no memory insist on their originality, which is kind of ironic because the quote is attributed because we don't actually remember who actually said it, but she seems to have said it at some point, but probably lots of other people did as well. And so but it does kind of raise this question, where do we actually keep our memories? You know, kind of an obvious question, but first obvious question, always been our brains, right? So they've been with us since the very beginning, do a pretty good job. You put stuff in, take it out, remix it, reuse it, like in this 1810 illustration from a medical textbook. But when you have groups of people collaborating, which is kind of what we generally call culture, then suddenly you need other places to put things. You suddenly need a space to put things, to remember. So these Victorians could visit the Egypt room of the British Museum in 1847, and they can learn and be inspired by cultures that are very far away from their own. So they can share memories with other people. And when we put enough memories together, we can kind of put them on a little shelf, or even move them around, like this perambulating library of mechanics in 1860. So the society put together all the stuff that they knew and just kind of moves it around Europe to where it needs to be to make sure that everyone can learn a particular thing. So you can move these memories of how to do something directly to where the people are doing it, and that scales to a certain extent. But then when you look at the world, that's a lot of potential stores of memory. It's a lot of culture. Even in this map from 1596, you can see the general shape of the world was pretty well known. I mean, we might quibble a little bit with a few of these shapes over here, but Europe was pretty well explored. But each group of people really had their own memories to keep, and so now, how in the world do we connect what this guy knows to this guy knows to this guy knows to this guy knows? And the answer is obvious, and of course you know what I'm going to say. I mean, these days we use computers, we use digital representations, we use proxies of our memories. So, like if you've got this IBM 360 mainframe, 1969, we just kind of put our memories in and kind of reuse them and remix them and retrieve them anywhere. So we finally actually have a tool that can start to help us with that question of where do we keep our memories? Well, now we keep our memories in a sort of distributed network of computers. We have them in our brains, we have them in our libraries, we have them in our museums, but increasingly they're everywhere. They're around the world. We can pull them out of the air. But, so now we have these millions of outside sources to feed our thought and our creativity. So how does that connect to how we actually think now? Well, even a while ago, Mark Twain said that all ideas are secondhand, that both consciously and unconsciously they are drawn from a million outside sources. So whether he had a million outside sources or whether he just had access to 10,000 books in a library, we certainly have millions of outside sources now. And so if these ideas are secondhand, if all of our thoughts, if all of our creativity is being shaped by kind of the influence of memory coming from outside ourselves, it raises this real second question. What do we do with it? Do we act as reuse machines? Do we copy and appropriate and reproduce? Or are we kind of set up to be remix machines? Do we remix, recycle, transform, make things into completely new forms? Again, you probably know what I think the answer is. I mean, here we have this clothing ad, 1860, very fashionable gentleman there. Nice to see that mustaches have come back, maybe not quite in that form. I'm sure I've seen a couple hats that look kind of like that lately. Not sure about the cricket guy. But, this is the height of leading fashion in 1860. Leading fashion for men. So, the mustaches are back, but some of the other shapes and fabrics are very, very strange. But, is it really so far from those particular high colors and very straight lines to this, fashionable overcoat that, a Welsh designer did in 1962? I mean, I'm sure that the guy didn't spend his time, going through Victorian catalogs, but the idea of a connected line of fashion design that kind of spans generations certainly has to have been in his head. You're not going to create a coat just completely from scratch. You're going to be completely aware of what came before you, and the best of our craftsmen, the best of our craftspeople are really, really good at knowing what came before. So this kind of idea, this is a kind of reuse. Whereas, in 1940, the Empire Theatre in Scotland might advertise their bands of the week, with a big poster like this. Actually, looks quite similar to the posters that I see in Belfast every week. But they use, woodblock typography, nice clear grid, rules, separations, and the same, actually, oddly enough, the same condensed Gothic that's actually pretty fashionable again. But 50 years later, a Jane's Addiction concert going on in Amsterdam seems to kind of reject the idea of machine set type. It's all hand-drawn, it's organic, there's no rules, the white space is not as symmetrical. But even the shape of the letters kind of starts to echo, a little bit of what that woodblock printing looked like in a previous generation. So reuse in this case becomes not, in any case, a reappropriation of the grid, but instead a sort of conscious rejection, but still with reference. So one other kind, we have this, here's an illustration of an eyeball from an Islamic medical text in the year 900. And, it's, sitting there and kind of generally being part of the understanding of what anatomy is and what eyes are and how we work. And then, 1,000 years later, you might have the graduating class of surgeons in India in a school that the British established as a way of sharing technical knowledge to the subcontinent. And so there's no direct reuse there, but there's very much a remembering what these guys learn about anatomy, what these guys learn about vision, what they learn about pathology. They're having to remember what's important. And that early drawing of an eyeball kind of feeds into that stream of ideas that eventually result in a completely different curriculum being taught. And of course, 100 years later, 150 years, we have a completely different version of medical science that's down in the next level of granularity. So, do we reuse or remix? Well, seems obvious. We build on what's gone before, not always literally. Sometimes we transform, but it's certainly part of that same sense of memory and culture. So that speaks to the sense of creativity as a completely individual thing. Our creativity comes from the culture around us and comes from these millions of sources that Mark Twain talked about, which makes you wonder a little bit about originality. So Jim Jarmusch, filmmaker, he said that authenticity is invaluable, but originality is non-existent. Which is weird, coming from a guy who makes films that people like to watch and that has generally been called a fairly innovative director. But with his idea of isolated originality being gone, what we're left with is actually a striving for that authentic, the real. And that very much raises this question of how do we capture that authenticity if we're not going to have creativity that's completely by itself and unique, but instead, in some ways, a product of what we know. Then what we can really go for is that sense of connection. We can create an emotional connection with people around us through our art, through our craft. So how do we move beyond the imitation, the transcription side of reuse, and get into something more real? Well, we can take a look. One way, you can look at the memories of an age, of a culture. So this Danish film poster, 2006, certainly says something about our attitude towards teenagers and theirs towards each other, something about their habits, their kind of desire for independence, you know. Probably even some of the bad habits that they join, and you can almost guess would be presented in this film. So, that's a recent idea of a single piece of art created for promotional reasons. It may or may not be fine art in the classic sense, but it certainly expresses something about the culture. Just as much, this ad for a leather shop in Amsterdam in 1980 tells us something, about Amsterdam in 1980. And unfortunately, you won't now be able to unsee that image. So I'm sorry for that. But it says something. We learn simply by looking at an artifact at a time. We learn something about what the values are. Moving back just a couple of years, migrant rights poster from the 70s certainly says something about what the sort of debate in the Netherlands about foreigners and immigration. And if we really want to know nostalgia, then maybe a poster for the communist youth movement in 1950 in Hungary. That certainly tells us something about the sort of nostalgic euphoria, combined with a modern progressivism organization person. This is very much as imagined by Central Party planners. They're deliberately taking elements of the past and bringing them into what is seen as being future and knowledge and learning, and even accidentally, the memories of an age, are always strangely compelling to go back and revisit. And if you think this is just a product of 20th century graphic design and the idea of how you can communicate graphically, I'd say that this cartoon from the year 1180, shows this poor peasant who, he just wants to, get the bristles off his boars that he can eat dinner, And 1,000 years later, we can really kind of see what he's thinking, I don't think he's having a great day. Now, I do think the kind of pop art picture of flames connected to the boar, connected to the 3D figure might tell us something about graphic design of the day as well. But if nothing else, we do actually have a sense of emotion, even from things that were in a culture so radically different from ours, full 1,000 years old. So how do we capture that sense of authenticity and emotion? Well, it's easy. We use trustworthy sources. We use the collected intelligence of an age. We use the things that people have said are important enough that they want to remember. So once you have that, it's not really where you take things from, those million sources. It's more where you take them to. So what do you do? Now that our collective memories are in these computer systems around the world, if we want to be as engaged, remix, reuse machines as we want to be, then we need new tools to make that work. So, I work on one of them, Europeana.eu. It's a website, it's a data service, connects some dots. All it really does is it takes, 3,000 memory institutions and, kind of has, takes the museums, the archives, galleries, libraries, anyone who has a sense of cultural memory, puts them together, common formats, mostly based on open web standards. So far they've contributed about 28 million objects, but there's, lots more to come. We're so far at the beginning of this. They can create one access point, and if this project is 5 years old, it's still really less than 1% complete. It's, we think we might make a dent in this process of just connecting what has already been digitized in maybe 20 years. And another 30 or 40 years after that, maybe we'll start getting more things digitized that are hard to reach for various reasons now. But it's part of that process of connection. It's just a tool. So, we can use this tool. We can show you, Dutch design of the 80s, which is very clearly designed from an earlier Swiss modernism. We can also show political commentary of the 70s. Or you can show, public health warnings of Russia in the 20s. In this case, these are the things you should not do if you want to not die of cholera and look like these guys up here. So it's probably good not to do those things. I guess eat fish in public seems to be one of the main takeaways there. Yeah, as far as I can tell. Sorry? Yeah? To avoid. But, lingerie ads, 1880s, certainly give us an inside look at fashion. But, it's just a way of saying that we believe that if you have openly accessible, digital cultural heritage from these memory banks around the world, that can actually create a better understanding. A better understanding of our diversity as people, better understanding, and even a contribution to a new kind of economy, a new kind of creativity. And so this project and this tool really answer some of these questions, tiny little bits of them, of reuse, of remix, of reference, even of rejection, of culture. All these things are possible only when you have access. And unfortunately, getting the access is, it's political, and it's slow, and it takes forever, and it's expensive, and it's hard. But with enough countries collaborating, you can actually make a small chip in it. Which kind of raises, one really last question, which is once you have the immediate access to the culture of centuries, at your fingertips, you can pull it right out of the Wi-Fi in this room and start using it. And 10 years from now, there'll be all sorts of stuff that you can reuse. So the question is, once you have access to that culture of centuries, what is it that you want to make, that you want to reuse? So that question, I have no idea. And I'd be happy to chat about it. So thanks very much.